All right. Today on the show, our guest is Erin Spradlin from Erin and James Real Estate in Denver and Colorado Springs. Let me tell you a little bit about Erin. Erin Spradlin works with investors in Denver and Colorado Springs. Her niche is the furnished medium-term space, which caters to people that need a furnished rental for more than 30 days. Not only is she an ambassador of this trend for her clients, she's also published a book on the topic, which is called American Nomads: Finding and Renting to Remote Workers. By the way, if you look in the show notes for this episode, you will see a direct link to Erin's book. So please go check it out and buy it. Now, 14% of Airbnb guests want, now this is interesting, 14% of Airbnb guests want 30 plus day rentals, right? So this is the rise of the remote workforce, and the trend is growing fast. So Erin helps her clients find properties and tenants for this model, which is the reason that we wanted to bring her on the show, because I was not familiar with this particular model. Please visit Erin at her website, which is Erin and James, and Erin is ERIN. So Erin and James realestate.com. Erin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, DJ. That was such a thorough intro. I appreciate it. And also clarifying that my name is Erin instead of AARON, which is sometimes throws people for a loop. So I appreciate that. And I'm so excited to be on the podcast. I love the podcast. So
thank you.
Super excited to be a guest.
We should also mention, before I forget, and I just did, and so I'm so glad you said the word podcast, because you have a podcast as well. Could you tell us a little bit about your podcast?
I do. So it's called Erin and James Colorado Springs Real Estate. If you Google that, we should come up podcast. But we focus on Colorado Springs, and honestly, we focus a little bit on Denver too, just because a lot of our buyers just want to be in Colorado. They're open to different areas. And I have lived in Denver since college, and now I'm back in Colorado Springs, which is where I grew up. So we feel like we know both communities really well. And since we've been in business, depending on what our investors or our home buyers want, we will point them in either direction.
Wonderful. And by the way, you can also get to Erin and James, the Colorado Springs podcast, from their website, which again is erinandjamesrealestate.com. And we will also, in the show notes, there is a link directly to Erin's podcast. So please check that out and subscribe. So I will re-welcome you to the show, because I forgot about your podcast. But I am really interested in talking about your business model. But before we get to that, would love to hear about your journey into real estate. So can you tell us about how you initially got involved in real estate, and sort of what that looked like, and how you've sort of transitioned now to working exclusively with investors?
Yeah, so it was an interesting journey. I think kind of followed a lot of people's, in the sense that it wasn't necessarily the plan, but both my husband and I were in marketing, and we had a background in marketing. I specifically worked for a small marketing company that worked for other small companies. So I had a lot of exposure to small businesses, and it was always a dream of mine to do that. My husband, so my boyfriend, now husband, at the time in 2014, we were dating, but we weren't ready to move in together. So we were spending a lot of time together. So I just thought, I'm just going to put my place up on Airbnb. And it's crazy, but 2014 was kind of early days Airbnb,
Real early.
at least for Denver. There weren't like a ton of options. And so I had put it up, and I thought, if I just make $400 a month on this, I'd be happy about that, and it would cut down my rent. And within 30 minutes, I just had $100 listings, or $100 reservations. And so then, it was just crazy. We actually ended up doing Airbnb arbitrage, where we were renting other places and renting it out. We promptly decided to move in together because the money was so insane that we're like, okay, we can do this. And then long story short, because we were making that kind of money, we thought that there were probably other investors or real estate people that would want to make this kind of money, and that would be interested in the laws around Airbnb, because they were rapidly changing, and it's a city to city thing.
Right.
So we both quit our jobs within a month of each other, which was kind of wild. But even though I didn't always see myself in real estate, I always wanted to own my own business, and real estate seemed like the fastest vehicle, and Airbnb seemed like a good niche for that. And as it just worked out, we absolutely love it. We think it's a really great job in the sense that, there's strategy involved. It's a good income. And then also it actually makes a huge difference in people's lives. So it has a lot of the elements in a job that you would actually want. And I think we're 4.5, 5 years into it, and it's awesome. It's the best decision I've ever made.
Wow. And did you ever have a traditional sort of realtor business where you were working with just non-investment clients, retail buyers and sellers, or people buying and selling the primary residence, or have you always sort of been in the investor space?
No, so we still do. So I would say, 25 to 40% of our business is just standard buyers and sellers, and
Sure.
then 50 to 60% is investors. I think we've always been investor heavy because we've done a lot of education and SEO and written a lot of articles for Bigger Pockets and just been in that scene
Sure.
for a long time. And so those clients have been great to us, and they tend to be repeat clients. And, there's also a little bit of intimidation around those clients. So I think if you feel comfortable in that space, and, I think a lot of those clients too are looking just for someone to double check their numbers or someone to talk to, because it is scary when you're making a huge financial decision for your family or for yourself. You want to make sure that, like, a lot of times it helps to have a second set of eyes or somebody that's a partner with you on that. And so I feel like we provide that for clients. And I think it's something that investors respond to.
For sure. And you had mentioned Bigger Pockets, and I only just want to pause for a moment because a lot of our audience may not yet be familiar with Bigger Pockets as a resource. But what Bigger Pockets is a great sort of a subscription-based forum model. They also have podcasts and books and lots of resources. But basically, they're a hub for learning about all things investments and chatting with other investors. It's really the place to be for the best education you could probably get around learning about investments, because it's people who just kind of live investments all day, chatting back and forth. So there's like a social aspect to it. And then it's really kind of a no-brainer if you're looking to really get into that space. I don't know of any other resource that's as vast. So, and we've had some of the Bigger Pockets guys on our show in the past. So for anyone who wasn't familiar with that and you're interested in learning about investments, and I'll ask Erin if there's any, things she wants to add to that, but I would encourage everyone to check it out. It seems like a no-brainer.
No, absolutely. I always tell people, I think your description was better. I usually tell people it's like Facebook for real estate. So
It
it's a
is.
great way to network with other people. I actually think too, they've been very heavy in the investing space for a long time, but my guess is long term, it will just become a real estate resource. And I think you're even starting to see that. So I think it's a good space to be in regardless if you're in real estate. And then I know Million Acres is also kind of making a push to do something similar as well. And I'm less familiar with them, but I do think it's interesting because you're starting to see articles, they're starting to see them enter that space as well.
Yeah. So just to pause this for a moment and just mention another great resource on the non-investment space. So the two best communities I found for realtors to hang out, and it's not just realtors, but the vast majority of people who listen are realtors to the show. Again, Bigger Pockets is awesome for investments. Anyone who does investments who's a realtor is probably already familiar, but if you're not, check it out. And then as a more traditional realtor, Lab Coat Agents is just insane. So check them out as well on the retail space. There you can find them on Facebook. But anyway, back to Erin. So tell us a little bit about, Erin and I were chatting beforehand. And it's particularly interesting because I myself am not, I'm not a real estate investor. I mean, I own a place, but I live there, so I wouldn't call that an investment. I've always thought it was funny that people will put their primary resident in their asset column on their, in their balance sheet. But it's not really an asset, right? Like it's only an asset the day you sell it, right? And then you have to live somewhere else. And unless you're renting or something, you don't probably get to bank all of that money. So I've never really thought of primary residence as investments. Of course, we're talking about, no, again, it could be your primary residence if you also have other units there and you're renting out other they call it, house hacking or multifamily investing. But can we let's just go through, because Erin has a very particularly interesting thought about investments. So, and this is just one little minor point that I wanted to have her discuss, but we were talking beforehand about cash flow. So, investors tend to want to look, it's long-term investors, not fix and flip, but buy and hold investors, right? They are typically looking at cash flow. So they want to see, net at the end of a month, like you were saying, you were making $400 a month. That's pretty good cash flow. But right now we're kind of in a weird spot with where we are in the housing market, and a lot of stuff's appreciated. And so Erin had sent over some math, a really simple math that said, if something's appreciated, $100,000, well, do the math on how long you'd have to make that up in passive income. And it could be, 15 plus years before you see that same return. Are you starting to have those conversations with investors who were buy and hold, who are now thinking, maybe I should cash out?
Definitely. I mean, I think for the last 2 or 3 years, it's been a big conversation locally in Denver and Colorado Springs, and not just for myself, but for a lot of real estate agents. And I think the frustration has been that traditionally the rental model and the way to have a good investment is to have really high cap rates and high cash flow. And that just does not work here up and down the Front Range, unless you're doing a short-term rental and you're managing it yourself, or a medium-term rental and managing it yourself. Then that might be.
I'm sorry, just to pause you for a sec, because what you just said was really important. And so short-term and medium-term, we're not talking about 12-month leases here. Now we're talking, what do you define short and medium-term as?
So a short term would be like 30 days or less, and traditionally what you think of as Airbnb, VRBO. Sure. And then a medium term, typically what we see is it's still furnished, but it's for the 30 days or more. And that usually, it's what happens is people will come in. Definitely this summer, we're seeing more just 30-day, 60-day rentals. But a lot of times these people actually will end up renting for 6 months or a year. But they initially come in with, a month to 3 month lease and go a little bit longer. And that's what we mean by that medium term space. Sure. And so if you're managing either of those yourself, maybe you can cash flow in this market. But if you're doing long-term rents, you have a property manager on it, it's very hard. And so as agents, sometimes it's frustrating because people will come in and say, I want this. And then you go through 3 months of them saying, the numbers just don't work. The numbers just don't work. And it's like, yes, they don't work because the rents have not matched the mortgages yet. But the point that, you and I had been talking about before we started was that, if you go to the Midwest or somewhere, you can have good cash flow. They're going to have $400, $500 a month cash flow. But traditionally, those houses don't appreciate. A house that was $30,000 20 years ago is $30,000 still. And this would be like Tulsa-ish area. Whereas, and I mean, I don't mean Chicago, basically, is what I'm saying. I'm talking about Kansas, Oklahoma, places like that. However, so people will think, okay, that's a great investment. I'm making $400, $500 a month in cash flow. But in Colorado, for the last couple of years, we've seen close to $100,000 in appreciation every single year, or in a bad year, 50,000 or 25,000. But if you take that one example of 100,000 in a year, if you did that in Colorado and you had that appreciation versus the same investment or similar investment in Oklahoma, that's $500 a month, it would take you 16 and a half years of $500 a month to get to that 100,000. So just trying to talk to people about how to think about investing differently, and maybe to question some of the advice that we've always taken as gospel. It just might not be relevant anymore. And I felt that way too when I first started investing and was in the short-term space. Some of the clients that I would work with, it was like, no, my dad invests and he says a multiplex is the only way to go. And and it's got to be long-term rents. And it was like, you should really be looking at the Airbnb numbers because they're stronger than that. They're going to appreciate. You're going to make way more money, and you don't necessarily need a duplex to do that. So just trying to speak to people about, like, yes, it's always been done this way, but there's potential for a new way to think about it. And I do think you're starting to see that more in the ether. And the other thing to add one more thing is that I think a lot of real estate advice sometimes that you hear is national real estate investing advice, and it really should be regionalized, right? Like the investment that you would have in Colorado is very different than the investment you would have in the Midwest. So just, depending on what your goals are, thinking about it and the best way to go about doing it.
And the other thing that's kind of neat about the Airbnb model, aside from the fact that, they're going to do a lot of the marketing for you and just, some of the headache around, figuring out who's a good tenant, for the short term or midterm now, is that, and I'm so sort of like this wouldn't have occurred to me because maybe I'm just not very logical, but my thought was, oh, if you're renting out, a property via Airbnb, it's going to create more wear and tear because there's more turnover. And I've heard of the exact opposite from investors, that there's actually less wear and tear because people tend to treat places they're only in for a couple of days or maybe a week a lot better than they might treat a place that they're living in for 12 months. Have you found that to be true, or is that not always true?
No, that's definitely been my experience. And I think the medium term space as well. I always say, people have a fear of tenants. And, I just personally have not really had a bad experience with a tenant. And I think some of that may come from the fact that I have been in the medium term and short term space. So I haven't, I've had one tenant that started as a medium term, and I think he stayed for 18 months, but still he took care of the place impeccably. And I have not, knock on wood, but I have not had a bad experience with tenants. And I do sometimes wonder if that's if part of the reason for that is because of the shortened leases.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, let's talk about remote work. So tell us a little bit about this trend in just the workforce, and how this has been an opportunity for you in the investor space.
Sure. This is a topic I feel extremely passionately about, and I think
Great.
investors should really be paying attention to. I kind of think it is the next step for Airbnb, and you're seeing Airbnb talk about it. The stat that you actually quoted in the beginning with the 14%, Brian Chesky has come out, so the CEO of Airbnb has come out and said, it took us 10 to 12 years to get to 14% of our guests that wanted 28 days or more stays. But in the last 2 years, that's now bumped up to 24%. So almost a quarter of their rentals are 28 days or more. And then
that's remarkable.
Right. And in 2 years. Right. And I'm sure some of that is the pandemic, but that's going to continue. And I think when you look at Airbnb, I think they believe that too, because there's a page dedicated to 28-day or more stays, but there's also a page dedicated to, it's called Try Before You Buy, but it has to do with Tulsa Remote and some other communities where they are trying to get remote workers to pick their communities to live. And that's because remote workers typically have $100,000 or more in salary. And places like Tulsa believe they're going to spend their money in Tulsa and potentially stay and make the city better. So it's a really good investment for them. So the Try Before You Buy is a whole page on Airbnb dedicated to these different cities that are making offers to remote workers to come in. And it's the space we've lived in for a long time, because we had Airbnb investments where we were doing Airbnb on it, but the laws changed or we just burned out on it. And so we ended up flipping to saying, okay, we're not going to sell the furniture, but we're going to keep these rentals but we're just going to make it 30 days or more. That way we're still complying with the local laws, but we can have these shortened leases. And it's just been amazing. The tenants are great. They don't pay as much as a short-term renter, but they definitely pay more than a long-term renter. And they're just easy to work with. You typically don't hear from them a lot. They're professionals. And we found this model to be very easy. And I'm passionate about this because I think in the future, you're just going to see more and more and more of this because of the remote work becoming more of an option for people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I imagine if the demographics say that people who are exploring these kind of opportunities, maybe going to another city for a month to try before you buy via the Airbnb sort of program, these are, and you said if the demographics say that these people make, on average at least $100,000, these are probably people that you would put in the professional category that have maybe they're not coming into party for the weekend and then leave. These are people that are really thinking about where's my life going to take me, and is Topeka, Kansas the place I want to be for that. And so there's all these communities and cities that are really eager to get this remote workforce, because the genie is sort of out of that bottle. The pandemic forced that hand. And, we've seen it here in Chicago downtown. We have these beautiful, wonderful, the cityscape that these beautiful office buildings that, I don't know what the occupancy is anymore, but it's still, I imagine they're struggling. And so I don't know how many employees are. I would be very curious to see in the next 2 years what percentage of the people who worked remote during the pandemic are still working remote. I don't know if it's going to be 50% or 25%, but whatever the number is, it's going to be a lot of people working from home that are now thinking, oh, I can work anywhere. And
well, yeah, and I think there's, a generation divide there too. They're saying some of the older population wants to go back and the younger population does not. They're saying 33% of the workforce is threatening to quit if they're brought back. And so I think what we're seeing is that, there's kind of two different ways of people doing this. So there are people that are just traveling to different cities in the US that they had a curiosity about and just living, for 2 months in Denver, 2 months in Seattle, 2 months in LA, whatever, trying to decide where they might want to live or just having that experience. And then there's also people that are moving into communities, but they want to live somewhere and check out the community and then decide what neighborhood they best want to buy in. And so that's the try before you buy aspect of Airbnb. So like saying like, come check out the community, don't buy a house yet when you don't necessarily know what neighborhood you want to be in. And I think it's interesting too, because the remote work that's absolutely pushing it. But in the past, people thought of this as the traveling nurse model or the corporate professional model. And that's primarily who we rented out to before COVID hit. And then also, just as a side note, when COVID hit, there were also a lot of people that did not want to spend COVID in their house with their spouses. So we actually got some people that were maybe on the brink of divorce, and this is like a separation period. And so that's also another subset that we get sometimes, but they tend to be high skilled.
Yeah, or they were just in a high risk environment at work. Maybe they worked in hospitals and it made sense for them to not be at home with their spouse because there was just contamination issues and infection. And so, yeah, that's very interesting.
Absolutely. We didn't have anyone like that, but some of my clients did. I actually have a client that had a place she had just bought in Michigan right before this whole thing hit. And then they were, really worried they weren't going to be able to get anyone. But when COVID hit, they flipped it basically into a rental for people, that, didn't want to endanger their families, or their families were vulnerable. So they would come and stay there, or they would be in quarantine basically, and then go see their families. So very interesting how this has changed things.
Yeah. And again, I'll be very curious to see what percentage return to a traditional 9 to 5, same office every day life. It's funny because you think like, okay, maybe the employer gets slightly less production because out of the employee, because maybe they're working from home and they're more easily distracted. There's not as much structure. So I think we could logically make that argument that they'll be less productive, but they're also saving on office space, the employer. So, it probably nets positive for a lot of businesses, not all businesses, but certainly a lot of them. And so as those numbers start to become more evident and published and promoted in the work of sort of the business world, it'll be very interesting to see how long people now stay in certain markets to live, or if there's just people typically maybe who are single or don't have children or are newly married and have the ability to sort of travel around more and spend 30 days here or there. And I know you guys have, obviously that's your whole model. You see tremendous amount of people doing that. I am curious to talk just for a moment about, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about pricing, because right now with so much appreciation that we've seen. And we hear more about it, I think, with primary residences. But in the investor space, are you finding it more challenging these days to make the numbers work because prices have appreciated, or is it in your market? Is it still possible to find some of these properties that and make them either cash flow positive or good sort of shorter term investments?
I have only found it to work in my market if you are doing a furnished rental, either short term or medium term. I'm not finding it working with the long term if you're buying anytime recently. We're also seeing people also buy places and then rent out rooms to individuals versus the whole house. but again, in a furnished space. And then also taking out the property manager, especially with the medium term. I think with the short term, it's harder because you have to have a reliable cleaning crew all the time and stuff. So trying to do that out of state can be challenging. I think with the medium term, I have strongly discouraged my clients from bringing in any kind of property manager, because I'm like, you just need a good relationship with one handyman, one cleaner, and then a smart lock. And that takes care of a lot of, and, and then as you go along, you'll get your systems down. And this is something I talk about a lot in the book, with checklists and how to think about how to write your leases a little bit differently and what the insurance product looks like and things like that. But I just think that we self-manage all of ours because we just haven't found it to be a big issue. Whereas I would never self-manage a short term, because I think it does require a lot of you. But I think, the long term, I don't know. I think it's really hard in Denver and Colorado Springs right now to have, you might break even, but I don't think you're going to do it with the 5% expenditures and things like that. So it's just, it depends on, what you're going for.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so interesting though, because it seems counterintuitive to people who aren't in the investment space to think short-term and medium-term rentals typically don't require property management or a professional property manager, third-party property manager. But you're absolutely right. My sister has a property in Tampa. She lives there. She has an investment property that's very close to where she lives, and she does short-term and medium-term rentals just like yourself. And I go, oh, who's your property manager? And she's like, oh, we don't need one. And they've had it for years. I go, she goes and checks it out every few weeks just to make sure things haven't, completely, gone to pot. But she's like, no, I don't need anything. She goes, I just need like you said, I have a great handyman. I have a great cleaning crew, and that's and Airbnb sort of takes care of the rest. I mean, it's really remarkable. And I wonder almost if property management companies are starting to, feel some pressure to compete in that space. So pricing you've seen increase. Has there been more competition from investors trying to sort of grab these properties, and has that driven prices even further up?
Yeah, I think I just read something. There's a lender here that we follow, and I think you had an article saying that 30% of properties being bought in the last 12 months were cash, and quite a few of those were investors. And so I think, I think it's kind of hit or miss, right? Like, it depends on the investor. I think in some ways we've benefited from this with the remote work, because when you can live anywhere, a lot of people want to live in Colorado, or they want to live on the coast. On the other hand, it's gotten so expensive that if you, again, believe or ascribe to that cash flow, it might turn you off because you're not going to get that in this market. So a lot of times too, what we'll see is people that actually do buy as a primary, and then they house hack. They have the basement or something where they rent it out. And you also find people that are buying now because they just don't believe in the long term that they're ever going to be able, if things continue to go the way they have been in 2 or 3 years, then buying a house in Colorado will be totally out of the question. So they're buying now, living, house hacking, or accepting of the fact that if they are going to do a long-term rent, that they might not cash flow on it, but eventually they'll have a house in Colorado when they're ready to retire.
Yeah, it makes sense. And also too, there's, with this medium-term rental, remote sort of opportunity, as I'm thinking about it from our listeners' perspective, these are going to be people, who are professional, who are highly skilled, and are sought after in whatever field they're in. And if they're able to, if their family situation allows for this, and their work situation allows, they're going to be able to be mobile. And this try before you buy thing is a really good idea. And so as a realtor, you might start to want to have these conversations with your clients to find out what their future goals are, right? I think that's a huge opportunity, because you can start talking about these things, and as a result, if the client is now saying, we may want to sell our primary home here, and now we always thought we were chained to Chicago or wherever, but now those chains maybe don't exist as much, and so we're going to explore other opportunities. So as the realtor, I might think, oh gosh, I'm now going to lose a client, but I think the realtor can still help with directing these clients to check out other cities and towns and say, hey, I've got some ideas for you. But also eventually that couple, that client may and probably will purchase somewhere else. And so that's an opportunity to refer business to a realtor in another state and city. So I think that's a huge opportunity, is really starting to build your network of people you want to refer to. Like, learning about other markets, which I know is daunting as a realtor to think I have to know about my market. And now I have to sort of understand other markets. But what really all you have to understand is, where do people in your market go, either for the winter? Where do they tend to vacation? Yeah. What cities are close enough by that are really attractive? Maybe they're more affordable, and start to talk to them and say, hey, what is your long-term plan here? I'm your realtor. And even if you move to another city, I still want to be able to help you. So anyway, I know I just went on a bit of a rant there, but I was curious. I was just thinking as you were talking, I'm curious if you see those kind of opportunities for traditional realtors who have clients that may be leaving town.
No, I think that's great advice. And we have really strong relationships with a realtor in Austin, and then also one up in the mountains, because we don't serve the mountains. And so those relationships have really paid off. I also just think in general, clients, this is something my husband's been very great about, and I feel like I have adopted more in the last couple of years, but I think clients really respond to you just being helpful and a resource. And even if it's not going to pay off for you now, people remember that and they have goodwill towards you, and it shows back up maybe in 3 years. Maybe it's not an immediate thing, but just helping people and educating them. I've just found people like that, especially in something as intimidating as investing, right? You can really help them, especially for first-time investors, like really help them feel good about it, and talk to them about a lot of the things they're afraid of that they don't want to admit, and say, this is totally normal and stuff. But also, to your point, having those relationships and referrals in other cities, and something I would recommend to other real estate agents is to go onto the Try Before You Buy page for Airbnb and see what cities they're talking about, because those cities are going to have remote workers that need furnished houses. And so it might be a real opportunity to buy up in those communities and have a furnished rental, because and I actually would pay attention to the ones on the Airbnb page, because I think a ton of cities are starting to launch these, and not all of them will be successful. And my guess is that Airbnb has really vetted which ones they believe will be successful.
So Erin just gave a really, really good piece of advice, and I want to double up on it. So what she said was, go to, and we'll link to this in the show notes. So go to the Airbnb, or just Google Airbnb Try Before You Buy. It comes up. And what you see there is a little description of kind of what that means. Medium-term rentals, space, 30 plus days, I think is kind of their definition. And also it shows all the communities that they are kind of rolling this out in. So Erin just gave a really great piece of advice, which is, maybe as investors, you're thinking about your local market, but this remote workforce thing is likely not going away. So look to see what communities are participating. And Airbnb is nice enough to show you exactly the communities that are participating in this, like Topeka, Kansas, I think is on the list we mentioned earlier. So this is an opportunity for you as an agent to then say, I've been reading a lot about this Try Before You Buy model with Airbnb, Mr. or Mrs. Investor. And I know we've traditionally focused here in our local community. I want to talk about this, and I want to start thinking about opportunities for you in other areas. And then as the realtor, all you really need to do is find other realtors who focus on these short and midterm rentals in those markets, and develop relationships with them, and hopefully start, passing leads back and forth. But you can also do that locally too. So if you are an agent who, maybe you're an agent in Topeka and you're like, I don't really want to play in this investor space because it's not really what I do. I like working with, first-time home buyers who they just going to buy for their primary or whatever. Find somebody who does this locally or in other markets. And boy, there's a tremendous amount of value. So you as the agent don't have to know everything. I imagine, Erin, you probably get referrals from other realtors who say, this is somebody that is right in your wheelhouse. Can you take care of it for me?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I always had something called the Orange theory, which was basically like if you're looking to invest somewhere and you're starting to see Orange Theory be there or Whole Foods or Starbucks, it's like you don't need to actually do your own research or demographics. They've done it
Right.
for you. They're not showing up for no reason. They're not dummies. They're there for a reason. And I think it's the same thing with this Airbnb and try before you buy. I'm like, Airbnb isn't, they have done the research to see who's doing it right and who's not. And so I think the logic kind of follows there. And I remember one time my husband was telling me, I think this is so funny, that he said, McDonald's does hundreds of thousands of dollars in research for real estate and Burger King does $0 in it. They just follow wherever McDonald's is. So
Smart.
just be the Burger King in this situation and just benefit off of the big companies that have the money to figure out where you should be.
It's such a smart thing. I went to Santa Fe about maybe 15 years ago with my mom, just as a little father or a mother son trip. And Santa Fe is a wonderful city. If anyone has been there, you'll know just how beautiful and lovely it is. But it's a relatively small city. It's not as big as you might think. But there are two Whole Foods in Santa Fe, and which is shocking for the population. And then you kind of go like, oh, a lot of wealthy people live here. Like, and then again, this is 15 years ago when Whole Foods was really just a wealthy person's grocery store. And it isn't so much that way anymore, although it still can be, of course. But I thought, oh, this is a place that is definitely growing and their population is increasing. And that point is very good. And so again, yeah, go to the Airbnb website for Try Before You Buy and just take a look at those communities. And at the very least, find another realtor out there who specializes in short and midterm rentals and start a conversation and say, hey, I'm going to start talking to my clients about your community. Can we ever jump on a three-way call with my clients who are investors? Or can I just start passing leads over to you? And again, boy, what a tremendous amount of value you have just brought to your clients without really having to know much about those particular communities. Real quickly, before we wrap up, I definitely want to get to the book, which we talked about at the very beginning, but not enough. The book is called American Nomads, Finding and Renting to Remote Workers. This is exactly what we've been talking about this whole time. Can you just give us a little bit more information on the book?
Sure. So, I mean, it's interviews with people that have done it. It's checklists that cover it. Just different conversations about how you might find these renters out. Airbnb is going to have it, but there's also other websites that we've used for a long time that we find to be strong that take lower fees than Airbnb. How to think about insurance, how to think about, what a remote worker would want in their space that might be different than your standard renter. And then also the difference between a remote worker that's a single, a couple, or a family, because I have a girlfriend that just did it for 8 months and she was talking about a kitchen is so important for the family, and then also privacy because you have to get away from your kids a lot, to maintain, business calls and stuff. I was shocked to see that nobody was doing second screens. And then also just talking about how you would advertise your particular, a lot of people say that they're good for remote workers, but then when you look through the listing or whatever, it's like, well, there isn't a private space. There isn't a second screen. They're not talking about Wi-Fi. So just talking about the different ways that you really want, what you want to put up front and how to think about these people. And I just really studied who remote workers were. And I really studied what they would want, and pulled checklists from our experience and things that we've found that have really streamlined it so that things aren't falling through the cracks. And it's just been really easy. And like I said, I'm passionate about this because it's been very good to us, and we really like those kind of those kind of tenants, and our clients tend to as well.
Yeah, and if you are an investor and you want to play in this sort of remote workforce space, definitely upgrade your internet speed to a really fast connection, and promote that in and I don't know what
Your
Airbnb
listing,
allows.
yes.
Yeah, make sure that maybe it's a screenshot of the actual uploads and download speed, but like that, I know for me that would be absolutely critical if I were to do remote work. I would it's embarrassing. I would hate to ask the owner, can you run a quick speed test and send it to me? But I would,
Oh, no.
I would need that.
Yeah, and also put it in your listing. Say the
Mhm.
speed test here is for this, and we're happy to provide that for you. On an end note too, I've found it interesting. A lot of people that can travel, singles and couples, they don't have kids, but they have animals that they are
Yeah.
very serious about. So being pet friendly, and if you have a fully fenced in yard, that will make your ratings go through the roof. That is a hard thing for remote workers or all renters to find on Airbnb. And so that's something where, again, in my interviews, it was just coming out like finding a place that was pet friendly was a real limiting factor. So I think you can charge more for that. And I definitely think for the demographic of remote workers, a lot of them care a lot about their fur babies. So being accommodating to that.
Well, the book again is American Nomads: Finding and Renting to Remote Workers. Also, everyone go look in the show notes for the link directly to the book, and you can purchase it there. Also, check out Erin's website, which also has links to her podcast, which is Erin and James, again, ERIN, and jamesrealestate.com. That will also be in the show notes. Erin, this was such a fun conversation, and it's really funny, just to pull back the curtain a bit on our show, we get, because there's so many real estate investment podcasts already. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of them. Bigger Pockets, of course, is probably the best example of that. But we have specifically not really talked much about investments since we started, and we get pitched by publicists every single day. Talk to my investor client who wants to come on your show, and we almost always turn it down, simply because we don't think our audience would find as much value in that as they could if they went to like Bigger Pockets podcast. But this has been so wonderful for our audience. I really want to thank you for making investment stuff fun to talk about. I really do appreciate it. And I love the fact that you're so passionate about this remote workforce sort of trend, which likely isn't going away anytime soon. And there's just tremendous opportunity there. So Erin, thank you on behalf of the audience for coming on and sharing with us this knowledge. And on behalf of Erin and myself, we want to thank our audience for continuing to listen and support our show. Before you sign off from this episode, if you're still listening, please follow us on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/keeping it real pod and hit the follow or the like button, and you'll get all of our episodes. And we also post an article every day about how agents can grow their business right on our Facebook page. And please just tell a friend about the show. Think of one other real estate professional that could benefit from hearing this great interview with Erin, and send them a link right to our website. If they're not a podcast person, just send them to keepingitrealpod.com. Or if they are a podcast person, just have them pull up their app and search for Keeping It Real and hit the subscribe button. Erin, thank you so much. We really appreciate
thank you,
your time.
DJ. This is so fun. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we will see you on the next episode.
Thank you.